Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Okay, so since we're in the last 2 weeks of the course, this is, I think, the last of the full lectures that I give you. We're going to have guest speakers coming to talk over the next little bit, but most of them are going to give you an industry perspective on both, like, what these last 2 weeks is supposed to be about for you. Like, what does this last sprint mean? Like, what do they do at the very end once they've got kind of their game idea and their level kind of set? Like, what happens in this kind of polished stage, at least in the industry point of view. And then next week, there's going to be guests who are going to talk about, like, what kind of things does this course lead to. The last lecture we had was about what does this course lead to for research, but next week I'll be talking about it from more of an industry point of view. So today is basically my main day to kind of give you or impart the last bit of game design knowledge that I have for you. And that is the idea of AI. And part of this taps into some of my research background, which was actually in AI, right? My master's was doing machine learning and natural language processing in order to do information extraction from the web. So anyway, so this is kind of like a marriage of both the background that I had when it came to looking into all sorts of different areas of AI and how they apply to games. So we'll get into that in a sec. The first thing I want to do, though, is just a couple of quick announcements about the course and the project. At this stage, one thing I need to remind people of is that part of what happens to you is we look to see what kind of contributions you made to the course. So participation is part of it, and we've been looking at things like who's been attending classes, who's been sort of actively taking part in some of the playtesting sessions and such. But we also get some people, like the people from your group, to report how you've been participating in some of the more group-led activities. So how well have you been attending meetings? How well have you been taking part in discussions and answering questions? And, just have you been a good team player? And so this actually does have an effect on our perception of your contribution, so that if a team manages to get a project that's, let's say your project gets like 80%, and it turns out that like 20% of your team basically just did nothing, then what we kind of say is, well, that means that the 80% of your team that did stuff, deserves full marks because they contributed, and they, like, on their own, with their contribution, they got 80%. If the last person was also equal in that contribution, they probably would have gotten 100. But, because 1/5 kind of didn't do anything and the other 4/5 did, we try to adjust the marks to help reflect like sort of like what your normalized contribution would be, right? So the people who contribute, like their project mark goes up. People who don't contribute, the project mark goes down. And it's the only way, it's the only way that anyone ever fails this course is by contributing nothing. So basically, it doesn't matter, like your project doesn't reflect how you actually did. Anyway, so one thing we like to do at this point is just to kind of touch base and help remind you of this. Just to say, like, have you done a little like self-assessment to say how well you did or how well you've contributed? And it's good to like touch base with your group and make sure that at this stage, especially in the final sprint, that you're still contributing and being a good teammate. Anyway, so that's going to be part of it. The last thing I want to talk about was we have basically the end of the course coming up. And the end of the course kind of means like two different things. And so because OCAD is still working on the games 2 weeks past the end of the last day of classes for U of T, that means that what we have is kind of like a two-tiered schedule of what things need to be delivered. So on the U of T side, what it means is that you're going to be working for like the next week or so on just polishing up your game from the structure point of view, and you're going to have to submit us like a playable build. This is actually going to be submitted through the Level Up website. Basically, Level Up was the event that we had been organizing for about 10 years before the pandemic hit. And what they're doing is that they're going to be hosting like itch pages for the games that are being put together in Ontario right now. So our main thing is to say, okay, well, the submission deadline for that is actually about the same time as the last week of class for us. And so past the last week of class, you're not meant to work on term work anymore. After the last day of class, you're meant to work on like your final assessment, and that's it. And so what we're going to say is, at the end, like about mid next week, you take whatever your current playable build is, and you submit it to this as, or like, this is what our feature complete build is, and it gets put towards this. Puts into a posterity as part of the showcase event. And then what'll happen at the end is that we're going to have like a little demo with Gameloft and Jam City. That's going to be the final assessment for this course. And that's basically like whatever you've made by the end of next week, that's basically your game. And for the 2 or so weeks after that, your OCAD side, who's still working on this, will add whatever outstanding models or textures or other aesthetic elements to take the game in its current state and just improve the look and feel of it. So the final assessment, the way it's supposed to work. So this is the question on the chat. Did Yukon pull out? It's more like we haven't really heard back from Yukon. So we, at the same time, we did start hearing more from Jam City because one of the HR people from Gameloft moved over to Jam City. And so suddenly we were hearing from them a lot more and hearing from Yukon a little bit less. So we'll do stuff with Yukon at a future date, but this final demo looks like it's going to be more of a Jam City Gameloft thing as opposed to the Yukon Gameloft thing that we did last year. And so the final assessment. So the final assessment is meant to be with the build that you submit next week. In terms of continuing to work on it, the idea is that the last 2 weeks, and this is partly because, from an industry point of view, you have basically a feature complete build and everything that's added in it is like the art assets. That's kind of the model that we're looking at here. And this is also partly because past the last day of class, you're meant to work on things like studying for your final exams, right? Like you've got other things going on. So the demo that's on the 21st is meant to be something where you basically just show up, but the time that you spend between like the last day of class for April 8th and this final demo, you should be working on other things like, final exams and study. That being said, your art team is going to maybe need a little bit of support because while we want you to be able to leave this in their hands so that they can take this build and they can add things without you having to be intimately involved in it. I mean, there's liable to be a couple of cases where you need to be able to I don't know, like enable some feature that, they need or, something small. But hopefully the contributions that you make will be small because it's supposed to be the job of your art team to contribute the majority of the changes from April 8th until April 21st. Anyway, so that's the idea. That's what's supposed to happen. So by next week, you submit what you've got. Like you make changes until April 6th. Submit it to the Level Up website. We'll contact team leads to let them know how that's going to work. Again, it's basically like a collection of itch pages, so it shouldn't be something too difficult. But from once April 8th hits, then you're meant to just sort of say, okay, and help show your OCAD teammates how to add things, show them the reins, and from that point onwards, it's meant to be up to your OCAD teammates to be able to make any final changes that happen. That's kind of their mandate over the last 2 weeks, just like it was your mandate at the beginning to kind of put together some of the basic game mechanics and understand how this game is going to look. So yeah, so that's basically what the plan is. We'll again send a little bit more, like as we get closer, we'll send you like the links to where you submit this, but we want you to kind of aim for the 6th to have something playable to submit. And then the 21st is when we're actually going to do the big demo with our industry partners. Are there any questions about this before we continue on to AI stuff? All right, well, let me know, But basically right now, after you've done your beta demo, like right now, the main thing should be just, okay, there's a couple little things we need to fix, but it should be just small little fixes as opposed to trying to make some big changes at this stage. All right, so let's talk about AI. So again, I can't guarantee that everyone here has taken an AI course. And so the idea of AI is something that you're probably all familiar with in some stage. I like to try to say that you're trying to create intelligent behavior machines. What does that mean? Well, typically AI is about, or intelligence is about, perception and then processing the information you get and then being able to express it. Missing one of those stages, it's unfortunate that it implies that you're not intelligent, but if you can't perceive something, machine's intelligence, then it's as good as not being intelligent at all. This often comes up in the context of the Turing Test. I'm trying to figure out if you're interacting with a human or a computer. And so the idea is that what we're trying to do is find some way of having our games perform at a way such that they'd be almost indistinguishable from playing against a human being, right? And not just any human being, but a human being whose job it is to try to make this game more interesting and exciting for you. But of course, being an AI person, if you ever have someone talking about what AI means, what is the first thing that everyone often comes up thinking about? So, of course, right? This is typically the thing whenever someone talks about AI, always ends up being like something to do with robotics and being able to do these kinds of human tasks. I can't think of how many times I've had people send me these, but basic Boston Dynamics, while they do some pretty cool stuff, they're also a great purveyor of really compelling videos. There's a lot of AI going on in the world, and especially at U of T. So while this is great, let's try to talk about more of the things that we can find closer to home and things that we are relevant or interested in when it comes to games. So AI in games can take many different forms. And you've seen it from as far back as things like, Pac-Man. And while you might say, well, Pac-Man doesn't exactly have a lot of AI, it's like, well, there is some scripted behavior for the ghosts in terms of how they pursue you, and each of them is slightly different. And so the idea of, there's some purposeful behavior that's scripted in there, that's AI. It's just not particularly intelligent. But it does provide interesting gameplay as, each of them behaves in a unique sort of way. But we have all sorts of other examples, everything ranging from like the classic AI games, things like chess and checkers, over to like weird experiments like creatures, social ones like in Fable, some things that do kind of like learning, things like Black and White, and where they really pump up now games like Fear. Now AI has become a bigger deal because in the past, whenever they had like budget, and budget would both be for money and disk space, because both were the things that were at a premium. Typically, any kind of available budget would be channeled towards graphics. The idea was that if you make the graphics of something better, it makes it look more realistic, then people are more impressed by it. But nobody was historically impressed by AI. One of the groups that I shadowed once, they were working on I think it was like EA theme park. And it was basically like one of those like roller coaster tycoon kind of games. And what he said was that he had put in this great algorithm for the people so that they would walk around, they'd have a general idea of where they wanted to go. They would just make sure not to hit anybody along the way. And so the crowds would have this kind of organic nature to them. And what he was told at the end was that they basically cut it out, replaced it with like random walk animations, because they wanted to have some of the extra budget put towards the graphics of the game. And so that was historically what always happened, is that graphics was always given favor until it got to the point where there was nothing else left to do. There was nowhere else left to go. It couldn't increase the frame rate of these games because past 60 frames per second and the human eye couldn't detect anything. So there was no point in trying to push that ceiling. Things were photorealistic, but people weren't paying attention to them because they were too busy just walking through your environments to notice all the stuff you'd rendered. So now people are looking to see, what else can we do other than graphics? Like what else can we put money into that will give us some more return? And so now AI has developed a bit of a resurgence. as people are looking at games to have more like emergent behaviors, or just behaving in ways that help to amp up the fun gameplay aspects of it. So this is where we get to things like game AI. And game AI has many different applications to it. The idea of this is that it's supposed to, create a more immersive and enjoyable experience. I know that people, when they think game AI, they usually think NPCs, but it actually goes well beyond it. Typically, people are housed in a department that's labeled as gameplay, because AI and general the general feel of the game, like these two things are married to each other, right? Well, what is AI's purpose in the game except to try to make the game more immersive? And so the idea of making things immersive isn't just restricted to NPCs, but is about a bunch of different things, how things behave in general. And so this is the idea behind what we're talking about today. It's AI, yes, but it's largely about gameplay, like trying to figure out what you can do to tweak your game at this point to try to make the experience more immersive, more engaging, right? This is all the final thing that you do. Now that you figured out what your games are, you figured out what your levels are, and you need to try to do things that kind of help make this, more viscerally enjoyable. That's what we're going to talk about today. So this is all about things like, trying to sketch out player movements and strategies and interactions, but also looking beyond just NPCs into things like how do objects and environments behave, because they are characters in your game as well, in addition to whatever actual characters or, like whatever sprites and things you have in your game. Also talking about our user interfaces and how you make them more intelligent. Okay, so this is where we're going to start. We're going to talk about things like objects and environments first, just to say, look, the stuff you've already designed, what can you do to those to help make them more engaging to the player? We'll talk a little bit about the UI, because, again, that's something where you might be thinking, what can we do to help kind of amp this up a bit? And then we'll get into what people traditionally think of with AI, which is things like NPCs. We'll talk about sort of the classical AI and what kind of problems people have been working on for a while. And we'll end off with what is the more modern take on how AI is applied to games, both for characters and just for the levels in general. Okay, so we've got 1.5 hours. We can do this. Okay, so start off with AI as it touches level design. And what we're going to say today is that AI touches everything. It touches level design, character design, UI, everything, right? Everything has some use of AI to it. So let's start with environments. So with environments, how does AI show up in environments? Well, what it means is that as you progress through your level is like a character in the game. And so it needs to be able to respond to your player the same way a character would, in terms of reacting in a certain way, behaving a certain way, and sometimes in ways that aren't just about like physics, right? Like drop something and it lands and rolls in a certain way, but just making it roll in a particular way or making it react in a particular way that may not be fully realistic, but kind of helps make the game more fun. So this is we're going to talk about things like objects, vehicles, procedural levels, all that stuff. Starting with objects. So again, most people are like, it's an object, right? When I put the cat down on the pedestal, it just sits there, right? Well, the answer is, okay, but could you do something that makes it behave in a slightly different way? Like, yeah, you could just drop it and let physics take over. But is there a way of kind of making it behave in some sense that, would make the game more fun or make the game feel maybe less frustrating, right? Like what could you intuit from how the players interact with your object that would allow you to say how it should behave when the person picks it up or puts it down, right? And you've seen this, right? Like sometimes you want to put something in a place and it doesn't sit right, or it falls off, and you just get frustrated trying to pick it up, and it's like, I just want to put it down, right? What could you do now that you're in charge of this game to help say, like, look at the player's intentions and figure out how to respond to it? So that's something I know like quite a few of your games are probably thinking about. If you weren't thinking about it before, you're thinking about it now as you think, oh yeah, maybe if they're supposed to like put down this thing, or if they're supposed to interact with this object, I could make this a little bit more intuitive since I know what it is that they're trying to do. This goes beyond that, though. That's just a basic idea of how you can implement some simple scripts, but AI work has been going beyond to do what's called action stations. This is the idea that if there is a significant object in your game and the player comes up to interact with it, that objects can actually take over the player's controls and start to make certain sequences happen. And so this comes up a lot when you see things like Assassin's Creed, and Ezio goes over and sits down on a bench, right? When you go up to a bench and you press the button that's supposed to engage with it, the game takes over Ezio's controls and the animation and makes him turn around and sit down and have this little this halo suddenly show up around him, indicating that he's somehow invisible all of a sudden. But the idea is that the game takes over, and the game has sort of like an intelligent way of activating your character and making it do things in the context of this object. So this comes up in things like you can have things like ATMs, you can have benches, you can have like traffic lights, a lot of things where, you get into, there's like a little box that's around that object. And when you walk into its sphere of influence, then some of your actions take on a different mode, and, you'll interact with the object in a specific way that you wouldn't if you were outside of this little region. So this is good for things like, it works for things like, guided landings. Like if you're trying to drop onto like a particular platform, what games will sometimes do is they will take over your animation, and they'll actually, instead of you landing where your controller is directing it to, it'll understand where you're trying to do and kind of direct you towards it so you land in the right spot. And so this is something where you can make your game more engaging, more fun by trying to figure out where do players want to be and how do I try to make things easier for them to get there, right? As with anything, though, you have to be really careful about doing this right, because while in theory taking over the player's actions and making things easier for them is good, occasionally this can sometimes yield even more disruptive behavior. So for instance, hello? Oh, it's not going to show it? Oh, that's a shame. What this was actually a clip of is this character basically just having the inability to get off of the ladder because they're just kind of stuck on it. Maybe I should have tested my animations before giving this talk today. Okay, well we'll find out how bad it is. Yeah, and first-person shooter auto aim. We'll talk a little bit about that too. So this also means like doing things like obstacle avoidance. So that as you get close to objects, sometimes there's these bounded boxes, like these invisible bounding boxes that will kind of clip your character and make them look like they're like running up against the far corner of a car. But it also deals with how other characters move. You can actually create these invisible regions in your levels when you design them that say, where are things allowed to be? And you've seen this sometimes when you're playing games that, you hit an invisible wall where it seems like you should be able to walk over there, but they've put an invisible wall here, so you're just running up against some invisible force field. So that's where it goes badly. Where it can go well is if you do this for the other characters and objects in your game. So you say things like, if objects are going to fall down, like say, you've got a game where you can take a room in your house and turn it over and make some objects fall out. You can basically say that, I'm going to make sure that every time it falls, it always falls in a particular place, like where I want the player to be able to see it. You can say that if you're a game where you've got a bunch of characters that are like trying to shoot at you for something, that they have a region that they are allowed to be in, so that maybe a particular combination of enemy characters would be interesting or meaningful. Instead of having them get split up by accident, you can say, look, there's going to be like an invisible region inside your level, and they can walk around, but they'll walk around in this region, so that the three of them will always be together and create that interesting experience for the player. There's things that you can do, right? Just the idea of creating this also has this emergent behavior of creating what's called like flow lines. So if you ever have a game where it's got a lot of player characters walking around on the street, underneath, invisible are these regions where like there's usually a line that divides up a road into two halves, or like a sidewalk into two halves. And so every character is meant to be on the right-hand side of that line, depending on which direction they're coming in. So anything that's going away from you would stay on one side, anything coming towards you would be on the other side. And it creates this idea of flow, where these invisible boundaries help create this impression that the characters are just moving continuously and not running into each other, when really you've kind of segmented the world into different directions, different regions where like people go in one direction versus another, and it creates this overall feeling of flow. What this means for you is that you can have in your world objects that actually can take on scripted behaviors and react in certain ways around you or in response to what you're doing. You can also create regions where if objects are meant to fall places, they fall in certain areas. If characters are meant to walk around, they stay in certain regions that you designate, and you can just keep these regions hidden so that the player can't see what they are, but you know that you're keeping your players together in a way that helps make the experience better. This also means is we try to encourage people to not use Unity's default gravity. The people who are going to be looking at your games, they all recognize Unity's default gravity settings, and there's a certain floatiness to it that doesn't work with most games. So if you do have anything where jumping is taking part, you really need to adjust the settings and make them behave in the way that actually fits with your game. And this also means trying to take out certain things that present unreasonable obstacles. So this is one of those things that we talk about with level design. If you're going to have a door as part of the outside of a building, make sure that it actually opens to something. A door that's just a texture is more confusing than helpful, right? And so if you have something where there's like a path and it feels like a player should be able to go into it, make sure that they actually can go into it, that you're not creating sort of these invisible obstacles because of the way you've placed your objects, or that anything where the level design communicates that there's a passageway here, you ensure that that's actually possible for players to navigate through. Anyway, so that's the idea of levels, right? Levels have to have some intelligence so that they can behave or respond well to you as players get into like certain situations. AI also relates to things like objects. Please let this work. Oh, this is so frustrating. I thought that these links were going to work. Objects also they're like one level above NPCs, right? Like things that can walk around your level. Like in this case, it's a vehicle. There's a fire truck in San Andreas that could go and put out fires. But I think in this case, they also had like while in putting out fires, they were not looking at the different characters. And this character that comes in from the side ends up getting like sprayed down, for no reason because they just happened to walk into the path. This is the idea that objects have behaviors, and they are as much characters in your game as the actual human-looking characters. And so there's always a bunch of behaviors that govern how they work. One of the first people who graduated from this course went to work for Ubisoft Toronto and was working on Far Cry 5, I think. And his main job was to work on the tow truck. And the idea is that the tow truck, you might think, okay, well, that was his entire job for the entirety of the game. And it's like, yep. Because the tow truck had to have a lot of stuff in it. It was both, the way the structure worked and how this thing behaved, as it rolled and how it controlled, but also, yeah, like how it responded to the player to be able to move in the way that the player was hoping for, so that when it turns left and right, it turns left and right in like just the right way that the player was expecting. How it handled like driving over obstacles, how the towing mechanism worked. Everything about that object needed to be able to have its own kind of behaviors tuned to make it as enjoyable to interact with as possible. And you might say, well, this is all just tuning parameters and like, adjusting kind of the responsiveness of it. It's like, well, yeah, I know this feels like it's just a UI thing, but a lot of it is also saying like, how should it respond in this circumstance? Like when it's on this kind of material, when it's on this kind of incline, like how is it going to go to? And that's where it starts to blur the line between what's part of UI and what's part of AI. AI is supposed to be about NPCs behaving appropriately in certain situations. There's no difference in this case between how a player would respond versus how an object should respond, right? They still need to behave in a way that is realistic and engaging and, feeling like, yeah, and has like a good like general feel to it. Anyway, so that's basically all I want to say about that. Make your levels, make your objects, understand that, even if it does seem like it's just scripting, that's all AI is at this stage, is making scripts that have a certain sophistication to them so that they create a more enjoyable player experience. Let's take a moment to talk about procedural level generation. Why? Because this comes up a lot. If you're not doing it with your game in some way, you're going to have a moment where you're going to think, all right, I want to do some procedural level generation stuff. Like that stuff is cool. And it is cool. The one thing that's kind of lost, though, or something that people tend to forget, is that there's a difference between procedural level generation or anything procedural and the word random. And you might think, well, isn't that what procedural is? It's just randomizing things. It's like, yes, but truly procedural things involve like a very controlled, purposeful randomness. All right. And so one example is things like Binding of Isaac, right? Is that when you're playing this thing, the levels are going to be different every time, right? And so you might think, oh, good, like it's randomized level generation. And the idea is like randomized in that it's not the same way each time, but not random as in it doesn't follow any rules at all. At any stage when they're making procedural level content, there's always going to be like a certain number of rooms that need to be there and a certain number of like non-core rooms. And they are drawn from a pool and they have very specific ways that they can interact with each other. And so you might think, well, as long as one of them has a door on the left and the other one has a door on the right, then they can join. It goes beyond that. They create these things in order to try to generate an experience. And so they know that things can join together, but they have to obey a certain set of rules in order to make sure that any joining has some sort of meaningful experience associated with it. And this is true with any kind of level now, where the levels are procedurally generated, right? Like the Rogue Legacy people, right? They were the ones who were talking to us about, or sorry, they presented some of the material before about like prototyping and what they needed to do, and that they're breaking like Rogue Legacy or Rogue 2 or Full Metal Furies. But with Rogue Legacy, and there's a like a randomness to it, but it's always that things have to be joined in very specific ways. That it's not enough for two doors to be able to link to each other, but there has to be the sense of like, you can be able to go back and forth between them, that there's something to be gained by moving from one to the other. And so there's this idea when you're making your games, some of you have games where some of the content is like randomly generated, like your enemies. You might think I'm just going to have randomly generated enemies. Well, that's great. But it's like randomly generated food. I mean, yeah, it might work out, but sometimes, you want to be able to construct something that's, it's got some purpose to it, like what this combination of enemies can give you, and this other one will give you. And then like having that kind of thing structured, there's a certain amount of randomness you can put into it, but you want to make sure that you're creating these, like curating these experiences instead of just having the game do things and make them like really easy or really hard by accident, right? And the reason for this is because when you put in truly random behavior, there is this impression sometimes that your game will either have no idea what it's doing, that the game's like the stuff it's putting together doesn't have any, like it's not challenging or it's not interesting, or it's a weird combination of things that were generated, or worst case scenario, that it makes it feel like the game is cheating. And now this is where I ask you, like, have you ever been in a case where you've played a game and you feel like the game is cheating? Or not that it's cheating, but that the programmer who was putting together, this game was being really, like, it's just being a jerk, right? I mean, the Tetris example is the classic one, right? That you end up with a situation where you're like, come on. I mean, what's going on here? And some part of you is thinking, the programmer for this game is either doing this on purpose, like they did something that recognized that I needed this long piece and they're purposely keeping it from me, right? Or you could say, well, you know what, if I was a programmer for this thing, I would have had this, like wring out this long piece long ago because obviously I need it. And, if the programmer was any kind of human being, they would have put something in that just throws me a bone every so often instead of, putting me in a situation like this and just making me suffer. I'm trying to think what other games are like this though. Tetris is always the classic example of, feeling frustrated and feeling like the programmer either is doing this on purpose and, being a jerk, or doing this by accident and being neglectful. What other games have this kind of feeling to it, right? Where you get to the point and you feel like the person who is designing this game has fallen short, has fallen short of their the expectations you have and what they were meant to do. Does anyone else have any ideas? And I mean, this is kind of where this can apply to your games too. So let's say you're a game where, I don't know, potions are falling from the sky, for instance. You want to make sure that they don't just appear anywhere, that they appear in very specific places that can enhance the experience in some way, right? Arcade games where you can only win like every 8th time. But yeah, so like say, these potions are coming down, like where would meaningful place be to drop them? Like let's say in front of an obstacle where you're going to need the ability to get over it. Or let's say there's a passageway you want to be able to go through, but someone dropped a potion in there and now you're left with this struggle of, do I go around or do I like walk through this and incur the wrath of whatever this potion is going to do to me, right? Either way, you're creating an experience by placing these objects in a very specific way and avoiding the whole randomness idea, right? Or the idea that even these potions, the contents would be random, is something where you'd say, no, I probably want to have at least, some kind of like distribution of, one potion versus another in different areas, and the idea of that is that, again, you can have randomness, but it's like a curated experience. You're putting randomness in a way that, you're controlling to be able to ensure that whatever comes out is going to create an experience that you're in charge of, right? Because otherwise, we have cases where, games feel like they're cheating or they're mean. Any game where there's like a roll of the dice, like you're playing some party game and you have to roll a particular combination in order to proceed, or you need to like, roll a 6 to be able to get unstuck, or anything where, it's up to some element of chance. There's some part of you that, expects that you would not be given, you do not be like held there for too long, that at some point, even though probability says that, flipping a coin a certain number of times doesn't guarantee you a heads or a tails. Some part of you says, yes, but that's real life. This is a video game. Video games should have a little more control over these random elements, right? And so then you have to ask yourself, are these things actually random? If they are truly random, then it's going to create this awful experience because, random chance says that you're going to get the roll that you don't want more often than you might hope for, and what you might expect. So they basically have to make these things that are random fit within, the human fallacy of what people think random means, right? Like the idea that, if you roll a die 6 times, you should get every number on that die at some point, right? It's wrong, right? But this kind of like this intuition that people get, that if you roll a die enough times, you're going to get a 6 eventually. Whereas probability says, well, no, there's no guarantees. In games, you have to fit with people's expectations so that, if something does happen and people are looking for a 6 and they never get it, they don't feel like the game is cheating or trying to hurt them. Things like if you're playing a game like Far Cry and, animals randomly attack you, it should never be randomly attacking, because if they just randomly attack, then they're going to come at times when it would really be awful for the player, and you want to make it so that the player's experience is challenging, but doesn't feel like oppressively painful, or like malicious, right? Any game where there's like a referee that's supposed to say, whether you score or don't score. If you make it, like if you don't put in like a certain purposeful behavior behind them, then it makes it feel like the game is cheating, because it's going to say like, what are you talking about? That totally wasn't 2 seconds, like a few minutes ago when the player had me pinned, that was like, they pinned me so much faster than this. Why is it that my player suddenly has, a different standard? And this can be true. It could be something that the game actually did, but some of it, a large part of it is player perception. And things like players feeling overpowered, like, the AI for a particular opponent always feels like they can get you right away. They have more power, they're more precise, makes it feel like the game is cheating, because it's like, oh, well, the game can like react so much faster than I can, so there's no way I can beat it. This is totally unfair. These are all perceptions, and they might be fallacies that people have, but you need to understand them in order to make sure your game doesn't fall into this. That if your game feels like oppressively hard, like say, if you are a game about, 2 kids stacked on top of each other that need to make their way through a hallway, that, it doesn't feel like the game is out to get you, that, the game is actually able to look at your behavior and respond to it and try to make the experience challenging without being like too, without being impossible. I'm just saying, right? You can do the little things that can detect how the player's behaving, how the gameplay is going, and make adjustments, right? You can say like, okay, they keep dying here. Maybe the more that they die in this place, the more I'll say slow down one of the carts to make it easier for them to avoid, right? Like, it doesn't have to be the same speed all the time. You can adjust things to kind of respond to how the player's experiencing your game. And so that's why we say that, AI is used to be able to prevent some of these issues. So let's see. What else? Anyway, so this is just talking about like little things that, like, when it comes to randomness, we really encourage you to get rid of randomness. At this point, your game's made. This is where you're supposed to polish, right? Take the randomness out and replace it with something that's a little bit more purposeful, right? And so this is also when we talk about things like interfaces. Maybe the game that you have is fine as long as people are able to like press a button in time or hit something at the right moment. So one of the things that we say is, you really need to work on your interfaces to be able to not just respond to what the player does, but what the player intends to do. So so one of the case studies for this was things like Bejeweled. The people who, so I don't know if you remember Bejeweled, but this was one of those like, Connect 3 games that people used to have on their mobile devices a long time ago. Like a little over 10 years ago, I think. It was a huge deal at the time. Anyway, the people who actually created this were Canadian. They have a studio that, I think it used to be something like Crazy Sexy Cool Games, and then they changed it because they realized it was hard to get things like visas when you've got the word sex in your title. Anyway, but they were a Canadian company, and they made this, and they, like, as they were making this game for mobile devices, what they realized was that mobile devices, it's a rough sort of interface to work with, especially back like 10 to 12 years ago. When you touch on the screen, the haptic device of like the touch screen is not always as accurate as you might think, both because where you come into contact isn't necessarily what you're looking at or what you're hoping to tap, and because sometimes even the touch screen doesn't record the exact position of your touch precisely. And so what they found was that people would be intending to touch one particular jewel, and the device would record them touching something else. And until you can actually improve haptic devices, or be sure that everyone is going to be on like a super sensitive touchscreen, you have to figure out what we're going to do in order to make this game more enjoyable. Because yeah, people are going to touch, they're going to activate certain tools they didn't intend to activate, and then they're going to lose their interest or the immersion in the game. Instead of focusing on trying their other strategy, they're going to be focusing on like, oh, am I touching the spot right or not? So what do? They looked at where the phone actually recorded your tap, and then they looked in the region around there to figure out which movement, which jewel, if we moved it, would actually have the highest score. And so they didn't actually go by what you touched, but they went by what they assumed you meant to touch. And they always made that the move that was done instead. So yeah, whatever had the biggest score, whatever had, took over the most jewels, that was the move that you meant to do. And they would always use that instead. And it was typically right. Again, it handled the idea of, it basically tried to use like intelligent inferencing to be able to search around the area that you touch to find the biggest payoff, and then use that to create the experience, or sorry, create the experience that the player was expecting. This gets into a whole bunch of tricks, but the reason why I mentioned this is because, I don't know, maybe you're a game where you've got like a pizza guy who's running through a level and jumping, and you need to be able to tap on elements of the environment to be able to get them to catch this pizza person and make sure they don't fall. One thing that's big in your case is trying to make sure that when the player is interacting with the environment, that you can get the intention of what they're trying to do, and instead of always just doing exactly what they're doing, right? And this means giving them a little bit more leeway in the kinds of things that happen. Like, maybe they were like, okay, I'm planning on tapping this thing, but maybe the pizza guy is about to fall through. You might say, well, I'm going to let this one go, right? Like even though the pizza person was about to fall through the platform, I'll just like do some magical thing where I lift them up anyway. And the idea being that you kind of look at what players are trying to do, and instead of punishing them for not doing it exactly, right? And this falls into the idea of like gameplay, and AI in games consists of, like, to a large part, a number of different tricks. When we talk about how the levels can interact and objects interact, it's all about little tricks that you can get the game to do in order to enhance the experience. Because this is all where this is leading, right? The ultimate goal is to make the player feel awesome. Not feel awesome for no reason. They have to do it in response to actually playing the game and figuring out the strategy. But doing little things, offering a little forgiveness, like doing little enhancements that can make them feel great for, going and engaging with your game. So this is kind of where all these little tricks come in. So let's see. I mentioned these things before I get into what AI is in industry right now. This is mostly just to help you figure out what you can do for your games. So what are some examples? One trick of AI, and this is something that some people were actually compiling over the years, like just what kind of tricks have they seen in AI in general. And so one of them is that when you've got a health bar, the health bar, like not all of the bars on your health bar are equal. This is similar to what happens in gas tanks, that when you're driving and the needle is getting close to empty, it's going to be on empty for a little while before it actually runs out of gas. It's not like as soon as the needle hits the letter E, then suddenly your car does this like, cartoony, comical sputtering and then comes to a halt. It's that, E is kind of the, okay, buddy, you better get to a gas station like right now, because I have a little bit of gas left, but I'm not going to like sugarcoat it. You got to get some more into me right now. And so this is the idea that the last bar on a health bar is always the biggest one, or the one that actually has the most health associated with it. Not like half of it, but just that not all of the little segments on a health bar are equal. When you get to the last one, that one tends to last a little bit longer than the others. And this is partly to make you feel like, if you manage to defeat the last enemy and you've got that sliver of health left, it makes you feel like, oh, I've managed to like rescue this level from the jaws of death, and you feel really great for yourself in doing so. Related to the idea of, like trying to catch a pizza guy on a platform, there's this concept that's used in games called Coyote Time. And you've seen this before, right? Like you're supposed to do this thing where you run towards an edge, like you sprint towards an edge, and at the end of it, you jump to be able to clear the other side. Game designers will always do a little invisible ledge that goes beyond what's actually drawn in the level, because you don't want to have the experience of plummeting to your death because you press jump like an instant too late, right? Or because you can't see where the edge is because you're too busy running. You have to almost infer when your player's feet are touching the edge of this cliff, And so Coyote Time is basically a model after Wile E. Coyote, who, can stand on invisible platforms beyond the edge of a cliff. Inevitably, Wile E. Coyote, it doesn't work well for the coyote, but in games, what they'll do is you can actually see it for things like side-scrolling platformers, that they'll get to the very edge, and the player it'll look like they're actually like pushing off of like empty space as they make their jump. This is all just in the name of forgiveness, right? You don't want to be so accurate that the player feels like you're being malicious. You want to have little things that can help enhance the gameplay, and give people a little benefit of the doubt in ways that they're never going to notice, but will be consistent with what their intentions are. What else? NPCs who miss their first shot. This comes up in games where, you've got like a first-person shooter idea, is that especially if you can't see the enemies, that they'll often miss when they shoot you, so that you can see the bullet whizzing by and then turn to see that someone's been shooting at you. So this is a common thing. Like every time an enemy AI is shooting at you from outside of your field of view, you make their first shot miss, and you make it miss in front of your view, so that like, oh, there's something coming from over there, and you don't have to find out about it by getting shot, right? So let's say you're a game about a bunch of first-person shooter enemies that cause your game to slow down if you get hit. This might be a good way of making sure that you don't get hit before you see the enemies. You have them shoot their first shot in front of you, and then every shot after that is your fault if you get hit. What else? Understanding when you're traveling. Like if you are and again, in any, like, let's say Final Fantasy games, right, where you're just trying to get from one place to another, if it understands that you're trying to sprint, then really, I mean, yes, you're supposed to randomly encounter enemies as you're walking through, but you can tell when a player is walking around trying to get enemies because they're trying to grind this level and level up, and when they just want to get from place A to place B. So what you can do is you can try to look at their intention, what they're trying to do, and interpret it, and then adjust the number of encounters that the player experiences. Dynamic health and ammo spawns. So this is something where you basically adjust what kind of power-ups appear. So when people talk about like, oh, I'm going to have random power-ups, it's like, don't have random power-ups. Look, if they're dying, make more health potions appear, right? If they're fine, make something else appear, give them more money or something. Like, the idea is you should always have the things that are spawned be intentional. Same with even enemies, right? If enemies are going to be appearing in certain places, make it so that it actually helps the experience. Like if they're close to death, maybe don't start bringing out like, a huge number of random enemies. Adjust the number of enemies that spawn based on what level they're able to handle. One thing that's awesome comes up is, I know we have a game where the speed adjusts based on your health, but in a lot of games, your attack will also adjust relative to your health. So that, again, if you're in a fighting game and you're like low on health, then that makes your attack stronger in order to try to adjust, right? So that you have more of a chance of making things seem close. Even if you do end up losing, you're not going to lose by as much because you managed to take out more from your opponent before you get your last health bar taken out. This is related to like things like rubber banding, of course. Other things, so aim assist. Again, this is like grid snapping, right? If you're trying to put something down and you put it close to where the eventual thing's going to be, then you can just have it snap in place. Again, let's say you're trying to put like, I don't know, a cat statue onto a pedestal. Yeah, you could just let gravity take over as soon as you release it, or you can sort of say, well, it's both useful for the player to be able to have things go where they intend, and also it's a good communication strategy to say, if this is where it's supposed to go, then if the cat statue snaps in place, then it helps the player understand, okay, that was where that was supposed to go, right? Because there's this behavior in games that I've come to expect, that things snapping in place means that you put it where it's supposed to be. And like we said, things like rubber banding. If you've never encountered rubber banding before, oh, I think I've got these things, the images out of order. Darn it. There we go. If you've never encountered rubber banding before, this is the idea of things like Mario Kart. Whoever's at the end will tend to get better power-ups, will tend to also drive faster. Whereas, at the end of a level, at the end of a lap, if you're in first place, chances are you're not going to be able to drive as fast as a person who's in last. The rubber banding is supposed to be like, pull a rubber band and tries to contract. It tries to help even the playing field so that people feel like they're in competition with each other for as long as possible. And dynamic scaling, yeah, this is the idea that weapons don't always do the same damage throughout the entire game. There are certain portions of certain games where, things like the knife, right? The knife is typically considered to be not the most powerful attack or the most powerful weapon. But if there's a situation where you want the player to use a knife, then you'll find that the knife suddenly ends up being more powerful. That you can change how many hit points something takes off based on the situation you're in and how much you want to reward people for taking on one type of weapon versus another. And the same things with enemies. Enemies can be like weak in one case and stronger in another. This comes up a lot in games where, fighting games where you're playing, you're playing a character and you have to beat them like 2 rounds out of 3. Often what will happen is the first time you play them, they'll be much easier to beat. And then when you have to beat them for the second to get like the best 2 of 3, that's when they suddenly become faster and more powerful. And this is all just the idea of, okay, well, give you one to be able to practice and to be able to kind of feel confident, but then amp up the challenge so that it doesn't feel like this player is a pushover. And this can also happen if a player is doing really well, like they're jumping into this game and you don't know whether you need to make a game that can adapt to both novice and expert players. If you can sense that, the player is an expert, they're basically wielding controls like a scalpel and just cutting through all your enemies. Okay, you can do things like dynamic scaling to help make the NPCs harder to beat so that the game is going to be at a good level, no matter what kind of experience your player happens to have. What else? Again, reading players' intentions. This comes up a lot. I stress this a lot because it's not hard for you to do, and it has a huge effect in making the game more enjoyable for people. But it's also not something that shows up in feedback. People don't know, right? They don't know that there's something you could do behind the scenes in your game that could help interpret their actions and make the player do what they were intending to do. So games like Portal. Portal 2 will actually actively stop you from making certain mistakes at key points in the game. Things like Bejeweled, will use where your player intended to tap as opposed to where they actually tapped. Games like, what was this one? There's some, I can't remember, this is a Might and Magic game where like you have the ability to say like kick a player, and when you get close and you press kick, it'll actually align you to make sure that you're actually like able to do it. And it'll also align you to make sure that where you're kicking the player is going to be someplace fun. And again, like what we talked about, action stations, you can have action stations that can make this experience more enjoyable for people. So again, things like, Red Dead Redemption, if you shoot a character, they will typically find some way of falling like over and do some ragdoll physics because it's more enjoyable. So at the point where they're dying, they do some death animation and they kind of align themselves in a way so that their death animation can be more dramatic. Anyway, so these are all like little tricks. Again, just mentioning these because we want you to understand what kind of things you can do to your games in order to help enhance them at this point. The rest of what I wanted to mention today is more like what's going on in the world in AI. AI, when it comes to games, takes on a number of different areas. Typically, it's going to be in certain key ones. So while there is a lot of research going on in AI, especially in this department, in things like reasoning and data mining, those tend not to be the ones that get applied to games so much. In the end, the most common areas are things that show up here, things like searching and pathfinding. And you might think, I've been doing searching since second year. How is this still a thing? It is. every game has a different way that search is applied and needed. And so people are always looking for ways of trying to enhance search in particular domains, or to try to help find solutions to particular tasks. It continues to be like an active area of game design AI research today. And those of you who aren't accustomed to like what classic game AI is like, game AI has always been used to try to help measure people's intelligence. And so, because the idea is that the human brain can look at a game scenario and be able to find solutions to it that computers have had difficulty with. We see this all the time in things like, chess solving AI, AI that could solve Go. Again, Go was one of those things that up until like 10 years ago, like was always seen as this ultimate thing. You can solve Go, beat an amateur human player, and there's a $2 million prize associated with it. Now it's like 5 years old. And so the idea is that the games are always trying to find ways of being able to emulate human players. And a large part of that is doing things like search. Because humans are able to look at certain scenarios and, find ways of solving things. And computer systems have to catch up. So things like searching and maps is something that, until Google Maps and MapQuest and other things were able to master this, this was always the domain of human operators that, computers were having difficulty matching. Now it's just taken for granted that we have the computational power and sort of the intuition of the space to be able to come up with good solutions. So how does that apply in terms of our games now? So now in games, it's just like we do search in ways that are meant to be invisible to the player. So this is Monument Valley. What you're doing is that you're doing a game where you control that character, but this is a mobile game. And the way you get them to move is by tapping on a place on the path, and the player, like the character, will automatically go there if a path exists. So you can see how this is searching, right? It's not that, the player will be aware of the fact that you're doing a search algorithm every time you tap. All the player is aware of is, I want to move there, and just move me there. And the game has to do a search task in order to be able to find the path that could actually make that happen, or return to the player that no path exists. Again, this is a fun game if you get a chance to play it, right? But a lot of things need to be done, like a lot of sort of calculations and like a lot of these algorithms need to be put in place in order to be able to do even something like this, like interpreting a player's actions and being able to move the game accordingly. So searching and pathfinding is still a big deal, right? And it's all about trying to take your game, reducing it into a certain number of states, and then figuring out what kind of actions can change the state of your game. And then figuring out, all the different paths you can take, like different actions you can take from the starting state through to successive states to find the destination that you're trying to get. Either it's a physical destination or it's more of like the state of the game kind of destination. But still, searching is still a big deal, right? And you've all seen this probably in other courses, making search trees where you need to find your way from the start state to some sort of goal state. The idea of having things like breadth first search and, looking for solutions one row at a time. Depth first search in order to try to go down one particular path in order to find the solution. But the ones that are used more often in games are things like heuristic searches. Heuristics will not just search through like every path, but will actually use some sort of function to determine where is the direction of their solution more likely to be found. And heuristics they're notoriously, well, they're very easy to do because you could do something like, I need to get over to that character over there so I can attack it. So I'm just going to figure out what the straight line distance is and head in that direction. But these things are always, they always have problems associated with them. I guess this one's not going to play either. Maybe it's just my older videos. Oh, media not found. That's unfortunate. But this one was a clip of these cars that were on the bridge in the distance and how they're like the enemy AI, they're trying to come towards you, the player. Because you're in a helicopter and you're at the end of an unfinished bridge, what ends up happening is that one by one, those things just use a heuristic to get closer to you and drive off the edge of the bridge. So yeah, heuristics are always easy to program, but have a lot of weaknesses to them. So the one that's most commonly used, even in industry today, is still A-star. A-star is a combination of both the path cost to get from where you are to some intermediate state, and also like, added to the heuristic of how far that state is from the goal. The idea is that if you're going along the path, like the optimal path from where you start to where the goal is, this A-star calculation of, cost incurred so far plus, estimated costs will always diminish as you go along the best path. Anyway, so this is something where, again, if you're going into game AI or AI in general, then knowing A-star is a helpful thing. How this is changing when you're playing against a character is that typically there's other algorithms used when it comes to having an adversary. Adversarial games means that you're playing at the same time that some enemy AI is playing, and that you have opposing goals. So what might be beneficial to your heuristic in terms of, say, taking out your opponent's pieces would also damage your opponent's heuristic, so they're going to actively work against you. How this works in classic AI is in things like game trees, right? Where it's like each player has a move, and so each one is trying to find the move that's going to optimize their eventual payout. Not the immediate one, like what your benefit is after one move, but looking several moves down the way to say, what kind of eventual goal can I get to, given that my opponent is going to try to take down whatever strategy I've got. Right, so the idea is that it's supposed to be that every position has a certain heuristic weight for you, the player. That's, it takes into account the enemy's attempts to try to like minimize whatever heuristic you've got. And this idea, this minimax, is the idea behind it, that there's the opponent is trying to minimize the ultimate heuristic you can get, and you're trying to maximize it. And this, at a simple level, is just saying, at every stage, if you and the player know that there's this, like, have the same information about what moves are available, every time it's your turn to move, you always move in a way that maximizes your gain, and the opponent works in a way that minimizes. And if it was only one move deep, then you could just calculate by looking at the board and say which one's better. But if it's several moves deep, you have to look to say, what are all the boards I can get to after n moves? And then based on the fact that my opponent will always choose the worst, and every time it's their turn, I always choose the best, which path leads me to, the best possible outcome given these two constraints? So that basically is what happens, right? Each player has like a max and a min, and you're considered to be the max because you're always trying to choose the best move for you. The opponent's always choosing the worst. And so you end up just creating this tree where, there's a search horizon that says how far down you can go in your search. And then there's heuristic values associated with every leaf node. And every time you have a layer, like a max layer, then it would promote whatever is the maximum value from the nodes below. And the min layer would promote all the minimum values from the nodes below. And the max would promote all of the highest ones. So this is typically how you would choose, out of all these different paths, which path is the one that you're going down in order to get the best ultimate goal, given that you can only search this far ahead. This is also why things like chess and checkers were considered to be a test of a system's intelligence, because the more powerful a computer was, the farther its search horizon was, and the more intelligent choices it could make. It's also why Go was so notoriously difficult, because unlike other games where the search tree actually, like the branching factor, narrows as you go farther down the tree because you lose pieces, Go didn't have that kind of convergence. So it was difficult to be able to look far enough ahead to be able to beat opponents in Go. There's things that you can do. When it comes to this Minimax tree, you can do things like pruning. That means that you can see, based on having searched down one branch, that another branch just doesn't have the potential to yield a better move. Like, that your opponent's already going to hurt you in a way that can't be recovered. So there's no point in searching down the rest of this branch. We'll just prune it and then move on to the next. So this idea of alpha beta pruning allows you to be able to just discount a whole branch without having to search through the whole thing, knowing that this branch isn't going to ever be chosen when you're figuring out which branch to take. There's other things like transposition tables that help to make different states equivalent to each other, so you can look at one and recognize it as having been something you've searched before, just in a different form. tons of different things that people do in order to try to make games like, chess and checkers and Go, these classical games, in order to try to be able to make it easier or like reduce the search space. And so AlphaGo is, at one point, the ultimate for this. Now I don't know what the next challenge is. Now that they've beaten Go, I don't think there is one. Well, anyway, let's get back to talking about what people are doing now. So that's kind of how things were classically when people thought about AI in the past. And still kind of an idea behind how people will play, like how people will create algorithms knowing that their opponent is going to try to oppose them, and how do you create a strategy based on that. But while like these classical games were considered the standard for how AI was created, since then, especially with things like more action-based games, you need to be able to respond in real time to challenges that your player is putting. So this is why, even historically, things like Pac-Man, right? We talked about how the ghosts, each of them has a particular strategy. One of them will just take like a random walk. One of them will always choose a path that goes closer to the player. But the idea is that this creates a behavior, a perception that each of the AIs have like a different approach, and and creates like a fuller experience as a result. Other things like Burger Time will end up using like search strategies to try to figure out, the best route that it can take in order to be able to get to the player. If you've never played this game, well, that's sad, because this was one of those like weirdly fun or like just hilarious kind of games. I mean, you have this anthropomorphic fried egg chasing you throughout these giant burgers that you're somehow stepping on. Anyway, but as we said, it's mostly about search these days, right? People are trying to find ways of improving search, because all of your games, whether it's Monument Valley, Burger Time, Pac-Man, or anything right now, is all about trying to search. Like, how far away is the player character? What's the route that I can use to get to them? Is there a possible route from like here to there? Like, is the player stuck? How can I do a quick check at any time just to verify that they're stuck? Or if you've got like a horde of enemies coming towards you, how do I script them so that they come at you in a way that, like one of them will come straight at you, one will come around the side, like teams in Counter-Strike, for instance. So basically, it starts with search. Right now, the modern research on game AI is still kind of based around search. And they'll do little things to help improve things like A*. So one version of it is called like iterative A*. The idea is that if you're trying to take your NPC and make them go towards you, they try to attack you, you don't want to have to do the full calculation of what path they might take before you take a first step, because then your NPC is just kind of standing there for a while thinking, and then eventually after like 2 or 3 seconds was like, okay, I'm going to go this way. What they usually say with iterative A* is that you start off with a heuristic search and you just say which way they're supposed to go, and you have them start walking that way. And while they're walking, you do the A* calculation. The idea being that you can then, after a certain amount, say, okay, now I know what the best path is, and make a small adjustment to get onto that path from whichever direction you happen to start in. And so sometimes you'll see AI, they'll react to you by like going in kind of like a random direction first, and then they'll figure out the path they need to go. So they'll like start walking towards you into a boulder, and then they'll realize that, oh, this boulder's not helping, and find a way to go around as the A* calculation is complete. This also led to things, because again, the idea of walking to the boulder, it always breaks your feeling of immersion. So some games have been trying to respond by creating, like, again, more action packs, right? Like those action stations we talked about. So they can, say, get to a place like a window and then climb through it. They can get to like a wall and they can vault it. And so these action packs, these action stations would apply to parts of the environment that can be used in order to teleport from one place to another via some sort of animation. So again, the wall will capture them, take the NPC, make them do the vaulting animation, and then get them over the wall or through the window. Anyway, other things like navigation meshes. Trying to do like a breadth first search of a level where you can stand anywhere is terrible. But what they can do is they can divide up this large level into individual sections called a navigation mesh. And then first off, at a high level, figure out how to move from one segment to another to get from point A to point B. And then within there, you can just go like through each section instead of having to search through the entirety of the level. What they'll also do is like they'll use this in order to say, well, as you're navigating through a path, you don't have to try to figure out, what the best path is to get from one section to another. They'll actually have ways of, doing like a funnel so that, you can sort of iteratively, as you include, the subsequent regions in this mesh, figure out kind of what the best path is through them by just sort of improving your perception of the best path as you include subsequent sections. There's also this idea of creating like these pathfinding methods so that, again, if you take your level and divide it into little sections, you can actually create these portals. So points between each section where you say, all right, if there's a boundary between two sections, make it so that the players will try to navigate from one to another, like, from like one portal to another portal, then they go through and then they navigate from one portal to another. The idea being here is that, again, if you're going through a hallway, you don't want to have to search through the whole hallway to figure out what places to stand. You can just say, look, as soon as I enter this hallway, just make a straight line for that point, because that point is considered to be the best place to move into the next section. This is getting back to what we were saying before about having invisible regions inside your levels. That, while it's good to have sort of these open levels and the characters to move around, if you put things in your level that help direct your NPCs on where they're meant to go, this helps to create an experience that feels a little bit more structured. Characters aren't going to get stuck behind walls or stuck behind bushes, right? They'll always know that if they're looking for you, there's a path that they're meant to navigate in order to get to you, not just the straight line path. So this is where we talk about for your NPCs. Again, let's say you've got a game where you've got a bunch of enemies that are shooting at you. Then you can say, if their main way of getting to you is by just straight line distance, then yeah, they're going to run into a bunch of objects. But if you were to put certain regions on the ground that say where they're allowed to go, they can keep away from these objects, so that they're not going to get pinned by them. You can also say, if they're trying to get to you, then instead of just going a straight line, you can say, well, what region is the player in? What region is my NPC in? All right, what's the route that I tend to take if I want to move them from whatever region they're starting or to the region that they're in? Like, let's make sort of like an invisible pathway that the NPCs can follow in order to get from start to finish. And so this gets to the idea of what people are doing with NPCs these days. Right now, NPCs are largely used in order to create a feeling of challenge, or to enhance the experience by being like some sort of companion character, or some sort of element in the game that helps make the experience or the level feel more real. This isn't to say that they always interact intelligently. Again, this would have been an animated quip. Is it saying that the media is not available? Oh, the media is not available. Sometimes they don't understand the parts of the rules of the game that you do, like staying away from exploding barrels. Sometimes they don't understand things like, they don't understand things like getting out of the way when, somebody's shooting at them, or if something is in the way, like recognizing that not being killed by friendly fire can sometimes create these, these breaks in immersion. Sometimes they have difficulty with, search, like how do I navigate from where I am to where the other player character is, and having just basic scripts that can help, get from wherever you happen to be to some destination without falling into the void would be a useful thing to have. And sometimes it helps to have these NPCs interact with each other or recognize where each other. In this clip, I think the NPC at the top jumps down and basically squashes the one underneath. So that's unfortunate. So this is all just about things like characters being aware of their environment and having you put like some structures in place in order to make it easier for them to maneuver through and not get thrown off by things that humans wouldn't. It also has the ability to create things like emergent behavior. So things like flocking. This stuff, I mean, they pioneered this stuff with things like the Lion King movie. That scene with the wildebeest going down the hill. I don't know if you've watched The Lion King or not. Maybe it's too old for all of you. But there was a scene where the wildebeest are doing a stampede down the hill. And what they actually did was they used some algorithm to help model this. And so what they would do is that they would take the wildebeest and tell them two things. One, go down the hill. Two, stay away from each other. And what they found was that created this sort of flocking behavior. So in this case, yeah, we've got the flocking of all the different, I think these might be zerglings. It's been a while. But the idea is that you send them over to a particular destination, and all of them have the simple rule of get as close to that destination as possible without touching any other characters. And so this creates the flocking, right? And the grouping and the separation. This idea of emergent behavior is one of the areas that AI is really interested in. That with a few simple rules, you can create this feeling or this experience of being surrounded by zerglings. Right? And AI is just that. People always think that AI is some magical thing, but really it's just an algorithm that helps to create this perception of intelligent behavior, right? And I say perception maybe a little pejoratively, but really, I mean, who can say what intelligence actually is, right? It's just the ability to behave like humans do because we consider ourselves intelligent. But really, if you can put in some simple programs that create behavior that's perceived as being intelligent, then, what's the difference, right? The perception of intelligence is just as good as intelligence itself. And so now the more common trend is to work on things like assistive AI, whereas before making NPCs that were always your opponents was the thing. And part of that is because once you kill your opponents, then they're not around for you to examine or criticize their behavior. They can be single-minded, and their main job is just to be a target for you. But assistive AI is different, right? Trying to make a character that's helping you or that can enhance your experience is always challenging because they're around for a lot longer. So you're always like seeing how they behave, and you're constantly making judgments on it. And their ability, like their purpose, is to help you, which is a lot harder than providing you with target practice. And so intelligent NPCs now, they started with the just like villagers that could react to you when you approach them, or in the case of things like Fable, they would hold on to some sentiment for you and they'd react to you differently based on whether you were popular or scary. And then, yeah, they get into things where, they start to get into animal behaviors because, again, much easier than human behaviors, right? Trying to create behaviors of things like fish that will react to you as you get close. But, again, more commonly now you have assistive AIs, so companion characters that can help you. And many games have this now to varying degrees. Some of the more common ones, or the more prominent ones, I guess, lately, are things like, Last of Us, like, the whole game is played with a particular character along with the ride. So they had to put a lot of energy into making this character seem and feel believable. But even things like, like dog characters or the horse character in Shadow of the Colossus, this character here, I don't know how many people have played Bioshock Infinite, but this is Elizabeth, one of the companion characters for you through the entire game. They put a lot of work into making sure that Elizabeth's behavior is always realistic. So there's talks that are done at GDC, the Game Developer Conference, where they were showing how, again, these are the invisible lines that they put into every level, that they have this one solid green line that indicates the goal and where you're supposed to go. And they always keep Elizabeth kind of close to it. Like Elizabeth knows where that line is, and she's always walking in front of your view and also keeping herself close to the goal path, with the idea that if you're paying attention to her, you're going to notice the goal more commonly. She also will go up to objects, see things, and look at them if they're more interesting. They put little things on top of these objects, little like attention points that every so often she'll randomly choose an attention point and look at it. Well, they put if there's objects that are of interest, they'll put a lot of these attention points on it so that she'll spend more time kind of going back to that object and drawing your attention to it too. But see, she'll always stay on the path kind of in front of you along the path to the goal that you were meant to travel, right? So as you start going down that path, suddenly she stops whatever she was doing and runs ahead to make sure that she's always kind of leading you or guiding you towards where you're supposed to go, that you're never going to be distracted from this golden path by looking to see where she went. And yeah, and so any kind of companion character now has to have a lot of scripted behavior in there. Some of it is things like procedural cover, so being able to look at whatever areas are around, and again, like the action stations, allow your animation to draw yourself into those areas and take cover when you feel like you're either under attack or the player character is taking cover too. This went into things like cover share, where they said, if your player is taking cover, then they actually scripted her to go in and hide underneath you as, part of the behavior that they expect you to do. This following behavior is kind of like what we showed with the Zerglings, that, those characters would always stay close together as they move towards a goal. Ellie would always be given certain points around the main character for her to stand. And each of them would basically, they'd fan them out, and then they would associate sort of a goodness with each of them. So that, yeah, these are all candidate locations, but you want to pick the one that's most in the character's view without getting in the way, and also not putting themselves in the line of fire. And so what ends up happening is that to make these things happen, there is a lot of invisible boundaries that are put into every one of these levels. One of them is called the idea of an influence map. Says if you're trying to put, say, Ellie in a certain spot, you want to put her in a spot where she's not going to get in the way or she's not going to get into danger. And so what they do is they mark off parts of the level to say how much influence does your player and all the good guys have versus the opponent player and the bad guys. And they actually make that, it can draw it as like a heat map that shows like the high concentration of where like one team or one group is versus the other ones. And then they see that there's a boundary between them that they try to keep players away from if they want them to stay safe. Or if you're creating a game that's based off of like combat and you want to send your NPCs somewhere, you can send them exactly to this boundary, because you know that if this area is under control by, say, your player, you can send characters from where you have control over to this boundary to create these skirmishes, in order to create situations where there might be some tension. If you put the characters in here, no tension, right? Because they're just going to get decimated. Put them over here, no one's going to attack them. But this would be the region that you want to send characters to in order to create some drama. And this idea of creating regions around where players are meant to go, these influence maps can be done programmatically too. Like, it's not just about looking at where the characters are in most concentration and finding kind of that boundary area between the two clusters. You can do these things where you can actually mathematically generate like an area around you based on just a formula, or some like mathematical expression that will create a region, that will create like an area that's considered to be good versus an area that's considered to be bad, and then like NPCs can gravitate towards the area where they've got like this highest fitness function. So let's say you're a game where you have some statue that is following you every time you turn around, right? And you want to try to make sure that this, the statue is always kind of coming close or has a path it can follow. Well, what they would do here is they would say this, the statue would always come close and would gravitate towards areas that are kind of within this range, right? So that, if they were in some position and they want to get close to you, they'd come and they try to maintain a position in here. The reason why this is useful is because this function can also be changed in order to incorporate things like the line of sight, right? So you could create something where it says, okay, I want to have something where the range that's immediately close to me has like a low happiness value, and the place that's farther away have a high happiness, and then keep the opponent character within the area of high happiness. But then you can also say, well, if I want to incorporate line of sight, then I can say, do that, but also add in the idea that areas that are within sight of the player character also have kind of a higher weight associated with it, whereas things that are out of sight don't. So what this does is it creates this feeling of, like, as this character moves, then the NPC will always be kind of staying close by, but kind of like right around the corner. They'll never get stuck behind a wall because they'll never want to stay here. They always gravitate towards an area where there's sort of the higher weight, and just trailing behind the character as a result. Or you can do the opposite. You can turn this around to say, I do not want them to be within sight. And what they always do is then they'll kind of hover in an area behind a corner. They'll want to stay close, but then anything that's within sight is considered to be a low weight, so that as you go around corners, they will always go from like just around this corner. As soon as the green character goes over to the right, then this will come around here and stay behind this corner. And so they'll always be just kind of creeping you from behind a corner. And then you can do things where you can say, okay, well, do the same thing, but also create a range of spaces around the objects that you don't want the character to go. So again, the weight was put on places that are far away from neighboring objects. And so now as your player character moves through the level, the companion character will walk through, but also avoid walls and just kind of, navigate through the main passageways. So then they say this, all right, if you were to take like this one and add it to this one, then you get this. And this idea is that now you've got a companion character that will always trail behind you, avoid walls, and try to make sure to catch up every time you go around a corner. All this stuff was done just by adding a few little functions to basically associate a weight with every spot on the level based on where the player character is, in order to create this, these areas that the NPC wants to go to, and this emergent behavior that keeps them close without getting them stuck and without getting them too close. So there's all sorts of great work that's going on here. But even with these ideas, there is a ton of work that needs to be done to be able to help polish this. So for this, we'll revisit the idea of Elizabeth from Bioshock Infinite. Like I said, GDC is this yearly event that takes place in March where they have people in the game industry come in and share the work that they've been doing. And in there, there's always an AI summit where they talk about the most recent advances in game AI. And so they're trying to talk about how Elizabeth is interacting with things in the level, partly to help assist the main character, but also to stay away from other things. So basically we try to make sure that she's always in your view. So she's always kind of running ahead of you, which means that her speed can sometimes just burst ahead because you've turned around and walked the other direction. She's like, oh crap, and then it has to like come and be in front of you. She always moves around to try to interact with things, always is making comments about the things going on around her. The idea is that if you wanted to have a guide of what goes on in this level and what's interesting, the companion character can kind of help lead you through it like an oblivious tour guide. Anyway, so some of the AI that's at work there is partly navigation to be able to figure out where this character is able to go. The idea that they're trying to guide you and what you need to look at, and so they mark off different parts of the level as being of interest to the characters so that they'll draw your attention to it as well. Some of the animation, again, people use idle animations as an example of how you put like simple animation to a character, but they do more to be able to have this character interact with the level, including looking at things in a scripted way. Like when she goes over to the bodybuilders carrying the medicine balls, she'll actually go over and try to lift one up. So it's not just about like looking around and doing these idle animations, but also finding ways of interacting with the level that kind of add to her personality and help you see what things are interesting. And always like, it's always about transmitting information. You want to help the player understand what they're meant to do and how they're meant to solve things, so they can help transmit what kind of mood you're trying to convey with this level, and also what kind of things you're meant to do.
For a good portion of the game, the player is in combat. How could we make Elizabeth feel like a lifelike partner for the player in combat?
All right, well, let's get to the part where he actually shows some of the combat scenes.
It does work well. Character who's supposed to.
There we go.
So it looks really great right there.
So basically, she's trying to take cover, but sometimes in going from one cover location to another, she walks right into the path of your machine gun, which is less than ideal, right? Yep, so you're trying to shoot at these enemy characters, and suddenly Elizabeth is right there, which is, not very self-preservational on her part. So what the reason I bring this up is because this is something that people in industry have to confront all the time. How do we try to use problems like this and solve them with AI? So anyone who goes into gameplay as an area would be doing this all the time, right? You'd be typically not trying to make the basics of the game, like how the mechanics work or how this level is designed. But once the level is designed and the characters and other objects are in there, how do you take the problems that people are encountering and use AI to solve them? So what they were doing in this case was they would actually do what we showed you with, that little square and the red and green dot. They associated the ground with a particular weight to indicate whether the player should, or sorry, the NPC should want to go in there or not. And so anything where there's a path between you and the enemy where you might be wanting to shoot them, they made the weight there extremely low so that, she would always try to navigate through this level, but always in areas that had a high weight associated because those were good areas for her. So whenever there's a very low weight, like the path between you and the opponent, then she would always get to that point, feel that there was like a giant gulf in the weight associated with that area, and then just navigate through the areas that were, that had a higher weight in order to try to figure out how to get from like one cover location to another. They were very clear about this, that they did not want, in the case of either Elizabeth or Ellie, to do any kind of teleportation. They were on to make sure that these characters could only go where they were like physically able to go. So they needed to figure out how to navigate through. What happens if she gets shot? Well, she never actually gets shot in that game. I think you can't physically try to shoot her. And I think that like the reason why they worked so hard on this was to make sure that she would never get into a position where she would walk in front of your gun. What you saw there was, again, the pre-alpha footage where they were realizing the problem, and then they solved it by making sure that she never got in the way and she was always hiding behind cover in some way. So what's going on, like in terms of what's happening in the future? Again, what we said was that most of the budget for older games was going into things like graphics, so that, games where there was some algorithm in place that was more intelligent tended to get neglected. But like we said, there's also a lot of areas that people are exploring now. So just the last thing I want to leave you with is just where are there still developments to be made? So largely things like, perception and being able to do, like the searching and planning and learning areas. These are all areas that, while people understand them to a degree in just regular AI, haven't had a chance to be applied to games. They're trying. So there's a lot more games where, vision is part of it, just having both like the characters' perceptions be taken into account when you're playing a game, but also things like using the Kinect and other kinds of peripheral devices that use like cameras to be able to understand what's happening. I've been doing some work on augmented reality games that try to use, your mobile phone's onboard camera and as part of, like looking at the environment in order to play in it. But also things like speech. This is something that games have tried to do this multiple times in the past by having some aspect where you can talk into your DS or, speak to the Kinect or something, right? There's always some sort of audio component that people try, but never get too far with. Similarly, language-based games, while there's a lot of things that have dialogue trees, typically those tend to be scripted, right? You have to pick one of several dialogue options. But there have been some in the past, and people have forgotten about this because, again, we've gravitated away from like text-based games into things that are controllable with controllers. This is something that came out a lot with the Type to Win game. The idea of having typing as an interface to a game is something that's almost been forgotten, because since consoles have come around, the idea of games being played entirely through your keyboard is something that, people just don't know about anymore. But it used to be that games were controlled by, typing in commands like, move forward or go west or pick up object. But still some of that stuff is there, and that there are games where the whole point of it is like a dialogue-based game where you can say anything and the computer is going to try to respond to it, and that's how you interact or navigate through this level. Planning algorithms just try to be able to create more authentic behaviors with NPCs. Some games have tried to do a little stab at machine learning, like mostly with reinforcement learning, to try to enhance the way the players or the characters behave, with like limited results. Some of the more egregious ones were things like creatures. Oh, it's too bad you don't get to listen to this clip. It's incredibly painful to listen to. But basically what they had was that these characters would be able to do certain random operations, and they had certain benefits that were associated with certain actions versus others. But what they experimented with was being able to change that kind of the benefit that is associated with certain actions. So that at one point, I think one creature was just like the creatures they're here, they're almost like Tamagotchis, or just like, like they're virtual pets. They would go around and start randomly picking up and dropping objects. One of them picked up like an egg that the creatures are hatched in. Instead of you dragging it over to the incubator, they just carried it around, and at one point, put it down near the incubator, at which point it created another creature. And that suddenly increased the benefit of everything it had done immediately before that. So that I think someone who was working on this game like walked away to make a sandwich and came back, and suddenly this whole level was like filled with creatures as each of them slowly started to learn the benefit of bringing eggs into the incubator, and eventually that maxed out their the desire that they had to completely like repeat this action over and over again. Multi-agent systems, this one's been worked out pretty well lately, but having multiple agents communicate a strategy to each other. Right now, if there's AI gaming competitions, this tends to be in the area that they go in, right? Using reinforcement learning to be able to have one team battle against each other and communicate with each other to help enact some kind of larger strategy. Dialogue options, being able to use dialogue to help create this feeling of intelligence or to draw attention for people to different aspects of the level, and to convey personality in these games. Anyway, the last thing I want to just talk about is kind of the AI research I've been doing with some of these games. And we talked a little bit about this last week, but the idea that right now there's a lot of work to be done in things like using like AI for things other than just game AI. So doing things like helping create recommender systems for games based on people's past purchases, being able to do automatic 3D terrain generation by training off of existing levels and using that in order to automatically generate terrain that's in a similar style, but adhering to some designers' basic constraints. Doing things like genetic algorithms for automatically creating game AI, and some of the things like music generation for games, right? We're working on making like automatically generating music based on some training pieces for a lot of the local game studios because they weren't able to afford hiring their own composer. They could feed in pieces of music into the software we created and then automatically generate music in that style without having to pay royalties to whoever actually made the original piece. There's some contention about the legality of that, but whatever. What kind of things people are finding difficult? Finding nearest neighbor searches is still slow. Being able to read player intents to understand what a click means. Being able to do things like have conflicting goals and resolving them. Being able to, the grid resolution where, if the positions that a player can occupy are smaller than the player itself, how do you kind of figure out, where to place a player in this kind of scene? Or things like tanks, right? Like if a tank needs to maneuver through an area, they can't use the same grid that the humans use. So how do they figure that stuff out? Again, the hierarchical searching. So we've got a big level, break it down to small sections, searching within those and kind of reconstructing that. And things like randomness, right? How do we use randomness in ways that can really leverage the power without feeling like the game isn't being constructed as much as kind of randomly thrown together? So this is kind of the whirlwind intro to game AI. What I like to say is that some of you are graduating this semester and some of you are not. And for those who have interest in this stuff, there's a lot of room to work in it. Anyone who has an interest in both AI and games, if you want, we'll talk, and there's lots of different projects to work on these days. But at the very least, hopefully this was at least like a glimpse into what kind of things are going on in AI in general, and also what kind of little things can you do to your games at this point that fall under the umbrella of AI and gameplay that can take what you've got and just tweak it to make it like a more engaging, more fun kind of experience. All right, that's it for today. We're out of time. Like I said, on Thursday, we're going to have somebody come by to kind of talk about like what you can do right now. Like what do they do in industry when they're at this stage and they have just a little bit of time to just put some extra little, like extra little sparkle into the games. So that's what we have to look forward to next time. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, and we'll see each other again soon.